Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be going over what weapon speed a warrior should use when tanking. This is a question I think is asked a lot and is misunderstood a lot. So I'm going to be going through kind of the short answer of what speed you should be using as a warrior and when tanking, and then kind of go into the detailed breakdown of what is going on. But let's get right into the simple answer. And the simple answer is you want to use a fast weapon when your rage bar is full, and you want to use a slow weapon when your rage bar is low. That's pretty much the simplest answer. Now, when you're doing something like a dungeon, a lot of times you are going to be using cleave on trash packs, and the same can go for raid trash as well. In those situations, cleave is a pretty expensive spell in terms of rage, and it's kind of tough to spend enough rage when you're spamming cleave. So in a lot of situations where you're in a dungeon or there's a bunch of trash, you're going to find that a slow weapon is going to be really good for cleave, and you're often not going to run out of rage. Slow weapons are good for cleave, and so short answer: a slow weapon is good for AOE. AOE tanking, dungeons, trash. A slow weapon is good for when you are trying to do more damage, especially if you are off tanking, and especially if you are dual wielding on a fight like Gertog, for example. If you don't have threat of the boss, but you're trying to keep up on threat, the majority of your attacks are going to be Devastate. So Devastate is going to be a weapon damage ability, so a slower weapon is going to be better there. And then lastly, when you're tanking a boss, if he hits really hard, you're going to want a fast weapon, but if he's not hitting super hard, a slow weapon can be a way to increase your threat. So that's the quick little overview. Slow weapon, generally great for trash, great for dungeons, great when dual wielding, and a fast weapon is best when you have more rage than you can spend. Now, with that, we're going to get into the nuance of everything, because that's the short answer out of the way. Now we're going to get into the details. There's a lot of contributing factors when it comes to what determines when you should use which weapon. So let's get right into them. The first thing, I'll just kind of go through all of the different reasons why weapon speed matters when it comes to tanking. The first one is going to be Devastate. So Devastate does weapon damage. So it's important to remember that. And slow weapons are going to benefit from Devastate. And for the purposes of everything we talk about, when I say a slow weapon, we're going to assume that we're comparing a fast weapon and a slow weapon. They're doing about the same DPS. The main difference is going to be the speed. Obviously, if you have a horrible slow weapon, why would you use that? And if you have a horrible fast weapon, why would you use that, right? So comparing weapons of comparable value but slightly different speeds is going to be the goal. So obviously, Devastate is going to be contributing a decent bit to your threat, and a slower a weapon is, the more threat you get from Devastate. Now, the percentage of your threat that comes from Devastate is significantly higher when you dual wield, because you're going to be using much more Devastate spam. This means that when you are dual wielding on a fight like Gertog I mentioned before, or even if you're facing some trash mobs that just don't hit very hard and you just want to increase your threat, there's definitely some trash mobs in Black Temple that do not hit very hard that you can dual wield without any issues. When that happens, a slow weapon is going to be significantly better than a fast weapon, so long as you do not have infinite rage, right? So long as your rage is not capped in full all the time. And I guess let's cover that really quick. When I discuss that, and I keep mentioning when you're high rage or when your rage is full, you want to use a fast weapon. Now it's pretty obvious, but just to make it crystal clear, the reason for that is obviously if you have a full rage bar, you can use cleave, you can use heroic strike, and you're going to be able to spam them. And so long as you have enough rage, you're going to get more uses out of the ability. So the difference is obviously you're going to see an increase in threat if a boss is hitting you that hits really, really hard. You're going to see an increase in threat from a faster weapon, because you're going to be able to complete a lot of heroic strikes. Every heroic strike you complete adds more base damage from the heroic strike as well. In each of the heroic strikes that complete, if you know how heroic strike works, it is a high threat modifier as well. So you can squeeze out some more threat if you're able to get enough heroic strikes off. Whereas a slow weapon, a lot of times you might find yourself with just full rage. You can't actually complete the heroic strike before your rage hits 100, and you're just wasting rage, wasting a little bit of threat, a little bit of damage. So that's what I say when I say, or that's what I mean when I say, if you are high rage, you're going to want to go with a faster weapon. It's just because you're just leaving heroic strikes on the table. And sometimes it happens in AoE as well. You'd be leaving cleave on damage on the table if your rage bar is constantly full. So let's talk about cleave a little bit more. So cleave is going to be a spell that benefits from a slow weapon in the majority of cases. And the reason for that is every time cleave connects, it does damage, not only based on weapon damage, but obviously the speed of the weapon is going to affect your cleave damage as well. To make a simple example, if you have a 2.0 speed weapon, every time you cleave, it's going to do a small amount of damage, and it's going to cost 20 rage. And if you have a 4.0 speed weapon, every time you cleave, it's going to do basically about double damage as the 2.0 weapon, and it still only costs 20 rage. So cleave is significantly more rage efficient with a slow weapon, simply because a big hit that is transferred to 2 targets is going to be twice as valuable as a really fast attack transferred to 2 targets. And in the case where you have a really fast weapon, you have to pay the price of the cleave every time it hits. So the slower, the more efficient. So you're going to find that cleave is significantly better with a slow weapon, and you're going to see a pretty significant increase if you were like tanking a dungeon with a slow weapon versus a fast weapon. A pretty significant increase to the amount of damage you're doing with your cleave, because again, 99% of the time in those dungeon or trash examples, you're not necessarily going to have infinite rage. Now, if you do happen to have infinite rage, you are going to want to use a fast weapon, even for cleave, because just because a slow weapon is more rage efficient doesn't actually mean anything if you have excess rage, right? So a fast weapon is just going to get a little bit more cleave base damage and a little more, regular cleave happening. So once again, you're going to default to the rule of, if you have way too much rage, always go faster. Then we can talk about next Impale. So let's discuss the topic of Impale. So Impale is an ability or a talent that causes your abilities to do more critical strike damage. So when they crit, they're going to do even more damage. Now, it's really important to remember this only applies to abilities. And so you might be thinking, well, what does a weapon speed have to do with Impale? And the answer is, if you have so much rage that you cannot spend it all, right? And let's say, put it this way, right? Let's say you're rage starved on a boss, and you keep running out of rage. If you're using a fast weapon, you're going to notice that the percentage of your heroic strikes is going to be very low. Let's throw out a number. Let's say 20% of your auto attacks will be heroic striked. Now, if we assume you were using a slower weapon, you're going to use heroic strike on more of the attacks as a percentage. And the reason for that is because you're going to dump rage slower when the heroic strike is queued up and ready to go through. It's going to dump rage much slower than a fast weapon, simply because you're not going to get enough attacks out. So let's say instead of 20% of your attacks being heroic strikes, let's say now only 30 or up to 30% of your attacks are going to be heroic strike. And the reason I didn't necessarily double it is because when you're attacking faster and you're using heroic strike on a lower percentage of your attacks, that also might mean you're connecting more auto attacks, and those auto attacks are going to be contributing to an increase in rage as well. So let's say 30% of your attacks are going to be, 20% of your attacks are heroic striked with a fast weapon, 30% with a slow weapon. That is actually going to translate to a potential threat increase with Impale. And the reason for that is a higher percentage of your damage is going to come from abilities as opposed to the fast one-hander. Every auto attack that connects that is not Heroic Strike is white damage and doesn't benefit from Impale. So the higher percentage of your attacks that are Heroic Strike, the more you're going to benefit from Impale. So if you take the Impale talent, you might even see a slight increase in threat when you're using a slow weapon, for that reason that more of your Heroic Strikes are converting your attack to yellow damage. Next, Deep Wounds. This one's really simple. I'm not going to go into it too much. But yeah, obviously Deep Wounds does weapon damage. If you take the Deep Wounds talent, which you have to take if you're going Impale, you're going to see that a little slight increase in threat from that talent when you have a slower weapon. Another one to mention is going to be Wind Fury. When a Wind Fury proc occurs, remember in TBC, it can only trigger from auto attacks. It cannot trigger from abilities anymore. But when an auto attack connects, you're going to have and it can, by the way, it can proc off Heroic Strike. Heroic Strike still counts as strikes, or counts for Wind Fury and Cleave as well. But when you proc Wind Fury, you're going to notice that the slower your weapon, the more Wind Fury is going to do. But if you have a really fast weapon, you're not necessarily going to get just way more Wind Fury procs because it has an internal cooldown. So for that reason, you're generally going to see a slight increase in threat with a slower weapon, because Wind Fury is more effective with a slower weapon because of the internal cooldown. Another thing to mention is now going to be the last two things I'm going to mention are going to be Snap Threat and in RNG. So this is where you kind of look at the trade-off of starting a fight off. If you start the fight with a really fast weapon in a full rage bar, you can dump a ton of Heroic Strikes very quickly into the boss and get, a very quick burst of threat. This is really, really nice in a lot of cases. One of the reasons why using a fast weapon can be really effective. However, you're going to see contrarily, if you're using a slow weapon, your first hit is going to be extremely potent. And so if you were to look at kind of like a graph of your threat, you're going to find that with a slow weapon, when your abilities don't miss, the first 1 second is going to be a huge burst of threat. Your first Heroic Strike is going to hit really hard. When you start devastating, your first devastates are going to hit harder. You're going to be a big explosion of threat right at the start. But if you miss, it can be really bad. Take, for example, again, comparing weapon speeds, right? Let's say you have a 2.8 speed weapon and a 1.4 speed weapon. And for this comparison, the only thing that really matters is that the slow weapon is twice as slow. If you start out the fight with missing your first two Heroic Strikes, right? It's really not a big problem for the 1.4 speed weapon, assuming no attack speed increases. You might get one of your other abilities to connect, but at least you're going to start generating threat from your Heroic Strike at the 2.8, and it goes 4.2 at 4.2 second mark, and then the 5.6 second mark, you're going to have two Heroic Strikes that have connected at that point. Unfortunately, for the 2.8 speed weapon, you're going to, if the first two Heroic Strikes do not connect, you're looking at, a tremendous amount of time before you're able. I mean, we're talking about almost 9 seconds into the fight before you connect your Heroic Strike versus the 4.2 seconds, right? So you can see almost like a 5 second increase, or 4 to 5 second increase in the amount of time it is going to take for you to connect a Heroic Strike. So long story short, I'm sure you get the point by now, but if you're using a fast weapon and you get unlucky, it's usually not too big of a deal when it comes to the Heroic Strike. You're going to be able to dump your rage really fast and get some snap threat going. If you have a slow weapon, you're going to have the potential for higher threat at the start of the fight because you're going to hit harder right as the fight starts. Your first Heroic Strike does more damage. Your Devastates are going to do more damage. If you get an early crit, because you're hitting slower and harder, that initial crit is going to be a huge jump in threat. Whereas with a fast weapon, a crit is going to be smaller. But all things considered, you just have to choose what you prefer. A more consistent opening or a more bursty opening? And the answer is always going to be consistency if you're trying to be reliable when it comes to tanking. And that's one of the reasons why a slow weapon can be particularly dangerous. Um, Even despite the fact that we've gone through all these pros of how a slow weapon can eke out slight increases in threat, you're going to find that it can be very dangerous at the start of a fight if you are missing. And even you're going to find, and there was some footage at the start of the video where I was using a slower weapon on a boss that doesn't hit very hard, trying to gain some value, a little more threat due to the fact that the boss doesn't hit super hard, and I can gain more from my devastates. But it's something that you really have to check. Looking at the fight against the second boss in Hyjal, you're going to see my rage got really high for quite a bit of the fight. It hit 100 several times during the fight. Now, it wasn't 100 the entire time. And so that's where it gets tricky. You have to ask yourself, is it better to use a fast weapon on a fight like that, potentially run out of rage several times through the fight? You're going to find that a slower weapon is easier to play with because you're able to just press Heroic Strike the entire fight and not really think too hard about it. If you are using a fast weapon and you are pressing Heroic Strike on every auto attack, not only do you have to press Heroic Strike more regularly to make sure that you keep queuing it up, but you can run out of rage. You can starve yourself on rage. You can reduce your threat because you are overspending your rage. So a one-hander can potentially be harder to use as well. And really, you just want to go, my best recommendation is to just try out a fight, see how your rage looks. If you feel like you were just max rage the entire fight, you really probably should make an adjustment. But using a slower weapon is definitely helpful, especially in the fights that you're not taking much damage. So again, to recap, a slow weapon is amazing when dual wielding, amazing when cleaving and AoE situations. When it comes to single target tanking, a one-hander is typically going to be the go-to for the majority of fights. For example, in a phase like Black Temple and Hyjal, despite everything I said, I'd still probably use a fast weapon on the majority of bosses. Again, potentially the second boss of Hyjal, maybe the third in some situations. I don't know. I feel like I'd probably still have plenty of rage. Really fights like Rage Winter Chill doesn't do any damage. You definitely would, a slower weapon would be great there. Moving over to Black Temple, I mean, a lot of bosses do enough damage that you're going to have plenty of rage to use a fast weapon. The fights where you would want to use a slower weapon would really be something like Gurtog Blood Boil would be the big one. So knowing when to pull out the slow weapon is going to be something that's going to really help your raid and increase your threat. But doing it at the wrong time is also going to hurt. And one last thing I'll mention is just keep in mind that as you're changing your gear, it's going to change the kind of weapon you would want as well. If you are using a lot of threat gear and taking a lot more damage, having a lot less avoidance, and potentially reduced armor, that is going to cause you to have more rage. And that might mean that you should be using a faster weapon if you are taking more damage. So just keep that in mind week to week as you're changing your gear. That's also going to affect what kind of weapon you should be using. But that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, guys. I think I covered all there is to talk about when it comes to the speed of a weapon for tanking. Let me know if I missed anything or you have any input on the matter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.